Number 3 has to do with this. It has to do with a paradigm shift. So let me just formulate it. Let us say that we made a 45 degrees shift, not 180, not 90, just 45 degrees, from economic growth to human development. From GN or GP to HDI. The human development indicators are, of course, a fundamental product of UNDP. And as you know, the chief head components are 2 basic needs, health and education. Now, health has an ability to absorb deficits in food, clothing, and housing. If you don't have adequate clothing and housing to protect yourself against the calamities of the climate, for instance, whether it's in terms of humidity or in terms of heat and cold, you will have it back in health deficits. In other words, very wisely chosen. Those indicators came out of work here in Geneva. Work essentially headed by one Pakistani and some other Pakistanis, centered also in UNCTAD, in a search for so-called physical indicators, and eventually focusing on health and education, with one purchasing acquisitive power component built into it. Nobody is saying goodbye to economic growth. All that is being said would be to go straight to the goal. Why do we have economic growth? It cannot be for a system to expand, for an abstraction. And everybody knows that no system in a finite world can expand indefinitely. Alfredo gave one very good argument. I could give the usual argument that any linear movement in a finite world will have to curl up and bite its own tail sooner or later. There are other arguments in that connection. But let us just say, what does this mean? Well, it would mean that we would be governed less by economists and more by physicians. Are we willing to do that? Whom do we trust more, an economist or a physician? I would say physician, but I would like to say they should not only be somatic, they should also be in mental health. Especially since, according to WHO, not mortality cause, but morbidity cause, number 1 and 4, are unipolar and bipolar depression. Unipolar is depression alone. Bipolar is manic depression. And my wife has introduced a 3rd category, namely unipolar manic, and she applies that to me. I think that can only come from a wife with deep insight. Now, having said that, they have something economists never had. They have a Hippocratic oath. They may cheat. They may sell their skills. And quite often they sell them to the pharmaceutical industry. And they sell it to the health industry in general. But by and large they have it. The economists have nothing of the kind. They will sell their skills to the payer. And they will be very interested in green lights, in not talking about dangers, but rather saying, go ahead. Which is the reason why they were not able to answer Queen Elizabeth. I have a little prediction. That question by Queen Elizabeth will be remembered better than the recent Nobel Prizes in economics. That actually a Nobel Prizes, not at all, but from the Swedish bank, to a large extent celebrating their masters, many of them living in Chicago. But having said that, could you argue for both? I think so. One could argue very strongly for an economic growth. but where the point is that all the time the basic focus is on relieving the suffering at the bottom, raising the lowest level. We talk about equality, we talk about that for a long time, and there are several models. One model is to take from the rich and give to the poor. That has worked in Nordic welfare states. Not very much was taken. They are quite well off, actually. But the poor came up at an immense speed. 10, 15, 20 years, and the job was done. Very, very quickly. Why isn't it done in other countries, in many other countries? Because the rich have too much power. You suggest that to them, and they will call their friend, who is, or let us say their brother-in-law, who is head of the armed forces, and the cousin, who is head of the police, and another one, who is the Speaker of the Parliament, and they will mobilize the government power of all kinds. We see it again and again and again. There is some ingenuity in the Chinese model, although it is also self-serving. Don't touch the people at the top, lift the people at the bottom, which incidentally was also a basic part of the Nordic model. I remember as a much younger person, the Prime Minister of Norway, who brought about this kind of a thing, saying in a talk in 1946, the people on top will not have much to fear, will by and large not touch them. But if they delight in being way above the people at the bottom, that delight will be taken away from them. They will find the people at the bottom coming up very quickly. Now, that's important. That's a question of solidarity, compassion, empathy, liking people who look a little bit different from yourselves, enjoying diversity. It's a question of men not being scared to death by the idea that if women come up, they will treat us the same way as we treated them, which is a frightening prospect. But rather analyzing how the whole system works and accepting parity with joy. Now, that's a paradigm shift. This paradigm shift has been in the coming for a long time. If you go to all these meetings, Occupy meeting, indignant meetings, like I do, and you have dialogues with them, for them this is absolutely taken for granted. Nothing new in it. They're just concerned with how do we put it into practice. Well, you can put some of it into practice by boycotting the 6 big in the US. That would be starting with Goldman Sachs, going on to Bank of America. Let's not mention the other 4. You know the names. And then building small savings banks around the country. Thousands of them that operate the old way. And maybe they might even be inspired by the Islamic Sharia, where you're not permitted to lend out more than 30% of your capital. In the US, the limit was 2,400%, and as you know, that was considered too limiting. How can you accept 2,400% as a limit? It was abolished, the sky was the limit, and the higher up you go, the more you go tumbling down. For those of you who read that particular part of the Herald Tribune, follow the Dow Jones Index. If you see it coming close to 13,000, get rid of your dollars as quickly as possible. You might also get rid of your euros. The danger zone is in the upper range of the 12,000s, provided the real growth is close to zero. If the real growth is high, finance economy growth can also be high, and should be. It's the discrepancy that makes it. So having said that, let me then retrace my steps and simply say the following. Open the South. Open South-South. Get Africa into it. Make a bioceanic confederation. Africa is big. There will be sub-Africas. A number are taking shape. That one would be one of the richest regions in the world. keep China and the US on a long leash. Practice the African proverb that when elephants fight, the grass suffers. Also practice the other African proverb that when elephants make love, the grass also suffers. Don't invite elephants in as friends, neither as enemies. Do it yourselves. Have trade, people, ideas cross in all directions. Not against the North. Don't reduce interaction with the North. Only increase interaction with the South. Number 2, lift the bottom up. There is suffering at the bottom. I find it tragic that people take market fluctuation as something to trigger action, not suffering at the bottom. 16% of US families having problems with food is much more important than the keepings and goings on Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs could sink. That might be an advantage. But you should not permit those 16% to sink in a life of indignity. Paradigm shift. Not 180 degrees, but letting health and culture come up. People living long lives, low on morbidity. The quality of death is an important part of the quality of life. You might say it's a little bit morbid to end with the quality of death. But the good quality of death is described in the Bible. Old and satisfied with his days. The person who says, I feel a little bit tired, maybe I should have a little rest. And that turns out to be the final rest at the age of 95, to put it that way. In other words, not being a frequent visitor to hospitals, where you will also find strange things going on, like in economic faculties. Having said that, we live in a world of complexities and contradictions. And here are just 3 ideas, not in any way mine. They are just sort of springing out of reality. HDI is as UN as anything can be, strongly resisted by United States, of course, as you could predict, because they didn't exactly come out as number 1, rather far, 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 far down. The raising the poor, strongly resisted by strong elites, and yet possible if you don't touch the elites too much. And South-South is something all of us can only benefit from. Thank you, and sorry for benefiting from Jeffrey Sachs, who did not come. I took his time slot.